In the autumn of 1968, on a quiet Sunday in rural Pennsylvania, the world as humanity knew it came to an end. Not with nuclear fire or alien invasion, not with earthquake or flood, but with something far more intimate and terrifying: the dead refusing to stay dead. It began quietly, as the greatest horrors often do, with a brother and sister making their annual pilgrimage to place flowers on their father's grave. With radio reports dismissed as pranks, with isolated incidents that seemed unconnected, impossible, unworthy of serious attention. Barbra and Johnny Morrison had driven 3 hours from Pittsburgh to reach the remote Beekman's Corner Cemetery. It was a ritual they performed every year, a duty to their deceased father that had become more obligation than affection. Johnny, restless and impatient, had never hidden his resentment of these visits. "We drive 300 miles for this?" he complained, adjusting his tie in the autumn wind. "You know, Mom could have asked somebody else to come and put the wreath on the grave." But Barbra took their responsibility seriously. She carefully arranged the flowers, said a quiet prayer, and tried to ignore her brother's continued grumbling about the long drive, the waste of time, the pointlessness of honoring the dead. Neither of them noticed the shambling figure emerging from behind a distant headstone. Neither saw the vacant eyes, the clumsy gait, the impossible return of something that should have remained buried. The dead were walking, and humanity's final night was about to begin. As Johnny continued his complaints, making jokes to ease his own discomfort with death and duty, he spotted the approaching figure. "Look, there's one of them now," he said, pointing at what appeared to be an old man wandering among the graves. But this was no mourner paying respects. This was something else entirely. Something hungry. Something that had forgotten what it meant to be human, remembering only an insatiable need to feed. The attack came without warning. The shambling figure fell upon Johnny with inhuman strength, grappling with him among the headstones. In the struggle, Johnny struck his head against a marble monument and lay still. Barbra screamed. She ran. Behind her, the thing that had killed her brother turned its attention to her, pursuing with relentless, mechanical determination. She reached Johnny's car, but the keys were in his pocket. The radio crackled with confused reports. Civil defense officials in Washington have asked that all radio and television stations stay on the air to broadcast any emergency information. But Barbra couldn't wait for official explanations. She had to run through the countryside, past abandoned farmhouses, seeking any shelter from the growing nightmare that pursued her. She found refuge in an isolated farmhouse, its doors unlocked, its rooms empty but showing signs of recent, violent departure. Blood on the walls, overturned furniture, and upstairs, discoveries too terrible to fully comprehend. Barbra had stumbled into the epicenter of something unprecedented in human history. The dead were returning to life, driven by an inexplicable hunger for human flesh. And she was about to learn that in this new world, the living were vastly outnumbered. The old Cooper farmhouse had stood for generations, weathering storms and seasons with the stolid endurance of Pennsylvania stone and timber. But on this night, it would become something far more significant than a simple rural dwelling. It would become humanity's last stand. Barbra found the house in a state of barely controlled chaos. Chairs overturned, family photographs scattered, the remnants of a normal evening meal still on the kitchen table. Whatever had happened here had happened fast, leaving behind only silence and the lingering suggestion of violence. She moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed at the cemetery. Her brother was dead. Something impossible had killed him. And now she was alone in a strange place, with night falling and nowhere else to go. The farmhouse felt like a sanctuary. But sanctuary from what? The radio continued its stream of confused bulletins. Reports of widespread violence and mayhem continued to pour in from all sections of the eastern seaboard. As Barbra explored the house, seeking some explanation for its abandonment, she made a discovery that would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. In the upstairs hallway, she found signs of carnage that suggested the Cooper family had not simply fled. They had been consumed. Literally, the evidence was scattered throughout the house. torn clothing, pools of dried blood, and worse things that her mind refused to fully catalog. Whatever had attacked the cemetery had been here first, and it had fed well. But Barbra was not alone for long. As darkness settled over the countryside, a truck pulled into the farmhouse driveway, and a man emerged from the gathering shadows. His name was Ben, and he had been running from the same impossible nightmare that had claimed Johnny's life. But unlike Barbra, who remained paralyzed by shock and disbelief, Ben had already begun to understand the new rules of survival. "We have to secure this place," he said, immediately surveying the farmhouse's defenses. "Board up the windows, block the doors. They're drawn to light and sound, but they're not smart. We can keep them out if we work fast." Ben had seen enough to know what they were facing. The dead were walking, but they were not supernatural monsters from folklore. They moved slowly, thought slowly, but they were persistent and numerous. And they shared one terrible characteristic: an overwhelming compulsion to feed on living human flesh. As Ben worked to fortify the house, other survivors began to emerge from hiding. Harry Cooper, his wife Helen, and their injured daughter Karen had been hiding in the farmhouse's cellar since the attacks began. Tom and Judy, a young couple, had taken refuge in the house shortly before Ben's arrival. 7 people. 7 survivors in a house, surrounded by the walking dead. 7 different personalities forced together by circumstances none of them could have imagined. The group dynamics that emerged would prove almost as dangerous as the threat outside. Harry Cooper, middle-aged and authoritarian, believed their only hope lay in retreating to the cellar and waiting for rescue. Ben, younger and more action-oriented, insisted they should stay upstairs where they could monitor the situation and plan an escape. "The cellar is a death trap," Ben argued. "If they get in, we'd be trapped down there with no way out." "At least we'd be protected," Cooper shot back. "Up here, we're sitting ducks." The debate raged while the dead gathered outside, drawn by the lights and voices within. Through the boarded windows, the survivors could see them accumulating. Dozens of shambling figures, increasing in number as the night progressed. Barbra sat in stunned silence, her mind retreating from a reality too terrible to accept. The others planned and argued and prepared, but she remained lost in memories of her brother's death, unable to function in this new world where the fundamental laws of life and death no longer applied. As the siege began in earnest, one thing became clear. The real enemy might not be the mindless dead pressing against their defenses. It might be the fear, suspicion, and conflict growing among the living trapped inside. The night was young, and already the bonds of civilization were beginning to fray. Outside the Cooper farmhouse, the dead continued to gather. They came from the cemetery first, the recently buried climbing from their graves with dirt still clinging to their funeral clothes. Then from the surrounding countryside, victims of car accidents, heart attacks, murders, all manner of deaths, both natural and violent, now unified in their hunger for living flesh. They moved without strategy or intelligence, but their numbers made strategy unnecessary. Like a slow tide, they pressed against the house from all sides, testing the barriers, seeking entry through sheer persistence. Inside, the survivors had divided into 2 camps. Ben led the faction that believed in active resistance, monitoring radio broadcasts, planning escape routes, maintaining their position upstairs where they could see and respond to threats. Harry Cooper championed retreat to the cellar, arguing that their only hope lay in hiding until authorities could restore order. The conflict between these philosophies reflected deeper tensions that had nothing to do with survival strategy. Ben was black, Cooper was white, and in 1968 America, that fact carried implications that even the apocalypse couldn't erase. "You're not giving orders here," Cooper declared during one heated exchange. "This is my house now, and I say we go downstairs." "This isn't anyone's house now," Ben replied evenly. "And being scared doesn't make you right." The radio provided fragments of information, but the picture it painted was more terrifying than any monster movie. The phenomenon is not limited to Pennsylvania. Reports of similar attacks have been received from other eastern states. Television broadcasts, when they could receive them, showed scenes of chaos from major cities. Military units mobilizing, emergency shelters overwhelmed, government officials admitting they had no explanation for what was happening. Civil defense authorities have established emergency headquarters in all major cities, one announcer reported. However, they stress that the immediate threat can only be dealt with by the actions of private citizens. In other words, they were on their own. As the night wore on, the dead pressed closer. They had learned to use simple tools, picking up rocks and sticks to break windows, shambling through the house's defenses with mindless determination. The carefully constructed barriers began to weaken under constant pressure. Ben and Tom worked frantically to reinforce their position, but for every gap they sealed, the dead found another weakness. The farmhouse, which had seemed like sanctuary, was becoming a trap. Young Karen Cooper grew steadily sicker from a bite she had sustained earlier. Her parents insisted it was just a fever, but her symptoms were unlike anything they had seen. Pale skin, labored breathing, and a look in her eyes that suggested something fundamental was changing. "She needs a doctor," Helen Cooper pleaded. "We have to get her to a hospital." But the radio had made it clear that hospitals were overrun, that medical facilities had become focal points for the spreading contagion. There would be no help from the outside world. The first major breach came near midnight. A group of the dead managed to break through a window in the kitchen, shambling into the house with arms outstretched and jaws working hungrily. Ben met them with improvised weapons, kitchen knives, a fireplace poker, anything that could destroy the brain and stop their advance. The fight was brutal and intimate. These had once been people. A farmer in overalls, a woman in a torn dress, a child whose face Ben tried not to see too clearly. But they were people no longer, and mercy would mean death for the living. "You have to destroy the brain," Ben shouted over the sounds of struggle. "It's the only way to stop them." One by one, the intruders fell, but their breach had revealed the truth. The house could not be defended indefinitely. The dead would keep coming, keep pressing, keep testing until they found a way inside. And once they did, there would be no mercy, no reasoning, no appeal to humanity. Only hunger. As Ben and the others worked to seal the breach, nobody noticed Karen Cooper's condition continuing to deteriorate. Nobody saw the change taking place behind her fever-bright eyes. The greatest threat to the survivors might not be outside the house at all. By 3 in the morning, the siege had settled into a rhythm of mounting terror. The dead pressed against every entrance, their numbers swelling as more victims succumbed to the spreading plague. The radio continued its grim litany of disaster. Cities falling, military units overrun, the fabric of civilization unraveling with terrifying speed. Reports continue to pour in from all sections of the country. The announcer's voice crackled through the static. The phenomenon appears to be spreading at an alarming rate, with government sources now confirming that the recently deceased are returning to life. Inside the farmhouse, the survivors had reached a breaking point. Harry Cooper's daughter Karen was clearly dying, her breathing shallow, her skin cold to the touch. But Helen Cooper refused to accept what was becoming obvious to everyone else. "She's just sick," Helen insisted, cradling the child. "When morning comes, we'll find help." But morning seemed impossibly distant, and Karen's condition suggested she might not live to see it. Worse, Ben had begun to suspect what would happen when she died. The pattern was becoming clear. Death was no longer final. It was merely a transition to something else. The discovery came when Tom and Judy attempted to escape. They had spotted a truck in the barn, and Tom believed he could reach it, fuel it up, and create a path for everyone to flee. It was desperate, but desperation was all they had left. The plan went wrong from the beginning. The truck's fuel line leaked, creating a trail of gasoline as Tom tried to maneuver between the gathered dead. When the truck stalled, surrounded by grasping hands and gnashing teeth, panic took over. The explosion lit up the night sky, consuming Tom, Judy, and a dozen of the walking dead in a fireball that could be seen for miles. But instead of clearing a path to freedom, it only attracted more of the creatures. The light and noise drew them from across the countryside, doubling their numbers. Ben watched the disaster from the farmhouse window, realizing that any hope of escape had died with Tom and Judy. They were trapped now, with no option but to fight until dawn and hope that daylight would bring rescue. But rescue was not coming. The radio made that increasingly clear. Military units are being assembled nationwide to deal with the crisis, but their deployment will take time. Until then, citizens are advised to stay indoors and avoid contact with affected individuals. Affected individuals. As if this were a disease rather than the collapse of the natural order. The truth about Karen Cooper became undeniable when her fever finally broke. She died in her mother's arms, her breathing stopping as Helen wept over her small body. For a moment, there was blessed silence in the cellar where the family had retreated. Then Karen opened her eyes. They were not the eyes of a child anymore. They held no recognition, no love, no humanity. Only hunger. And her mother was the closest source of food. Helen Cooper's screams echoed through the farmhouse as her daughter, transformed into something monstrous, attacked with inhuman strength. The child who had been their reason for hope became their most intimate nightmare. Harry Cooper rushed to help his wife, but the creature that had been Karen was beyond reason or family bonds. In the struggle that followed, Helen Cooper joined her daughter in death, and moments later, she too began the transformation. Ben heard the screams and rushed to help, but it was too late. The Cooper family, who had argued so strongly for the safety of the cellar, had discovered that there was no safety anywhere. Death had found them in their hiding place, and death had made them into something else. The cellar, which Harry had insisted was their sanctuary, became their tomb. And then it became something worse, a nest for the newly reborn dead. As the transformed Cooper family emerged from the cellar, Ben realized the terrible truth. The enemy was not just outside the house. It was inside as well, and it wore the faces of people they had known, people they had tried to save. Barbra, who had spent the night in catatonic shock, finally snapped back to awareness as the horror reached its crescendo. But awareness brought no comfort, only the full understanding of how completely their world had changed. They were no longer fighting to escape. They were fighting to postpone the inevitable. The longest night in human history crawled toward its end. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the farmhouse had become a charnel house. The dead wandered its rooms freely now, their numbers swollen by the newly transformed. Ben found himself alone, the sole survivor of what had begun as a group of 7. Barbra was gone, dragged from the house by creatures that had once been her protectors. The Cooper family had become the very monsters they had tried to hide from. Tom and Judy were ashes blowing in the wind. Ben had barricaded himself in the cellar, the same refuge that Harry Cooper had championed and that had become the family's doom. Irony was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was measured in minutes now, and soon even that would be exhausted. Outside, the sounds of the siege continued. But they were different now, more organized. Human voices mixed with the moaning of the dead, and Ben realized that help, or what passed for help in this new world, had finally arrived. The radio crackled with official announcements. Emergency rescue teams are now operating in all affected areas. Citizens are advised that military units have been deployed and are working to restore order. Through the cellar windows, Ben could see trucks and armed men moving through the morning mist. They worked methodically, efficiently, putting down the walking dead with the same casual precision they might use to exterminate vermin. For a moment, Ben felt hope. Rescue at last. Salvation after the longest night of his life. But as he prepared to emerge from hiding, he heard something that chilled him more than anything he had experienced during the siege. Laughter. The rescue teams were enjoying their work, treating the extermination of the dead as a sporting event. "Got another one," someone shouted, followed by cheers and the crack of rifle fire. These were not professional soldiers or medical personnel. They were local men, hunters, farmers, townspeople, formed into impromptu posses to clean up the aftermath of the crisis. And in their voices, Ben heard something that had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with the opportunity to kill without consequence. Ben understood with growing horror that in this new world, survival might depend not just on avoiding the dead, but on avoiding the living as well. The breakdown of civilization had revealed truths about human nature that were perhaps more disturbing than any supernatural horror. He waited in the cellar as the posse worked its way through the farmhouse, methodically destroying every moving figure they encountered. He heard gunshots, coarse jokes, the casual brutality of men who had found official sanction for their darkest impulses. When silence finally returned, Ben carefully emerged from hiding. The farmhouse was quiet now, its halls littered with the truly dead. The siege was over, but the victory felt hollow. As Ben stepped onto the front porch, squinting in the morning sunlight, he saw the rescue team in the distance, loading bodies onto trucks with casual efficiency. The crisis was being managed, order was being restored, and life would presumably return to normal. But Ben knew that normal was gone forever. The dead had walked for one night, but the living had revealed themselves to be capable of far greater horrors. The creatures that had terrorized them through the darkness had been mindless, acting on instinct. The men with badges and guns were something far more dangerous. They had chosen to become monsters. A rifle shot rang out across the quiet morning. Ben fell, struck down by men who saw only another threat to be eliminated, another problem to be solved with violence. The last survivor of the longest night in human history died not at the hands of the walking dead, but at the hands of his fellow humans. In the end, the greatest horror was not supernatural at all. It was the darkness that lived within ordinary people, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The crisis was declared over. Order was restored. The dead were buried, and life returned to normal. But those who lived through that night, and there were precious few of them, knew that nothing would ever be normal again. They had seen the future, and it was written in blood and ash and the casual cruelty of humanity unleashed. The dead had walked for one night, but the living had revealed themselves to be the true monsters, and they would walk forever. In the end, the night of the living dead was not about the return of the deceased. It was about the death of innocence, the collapse of illusion, and the terrible discovery that the real horror was not lurking in graveyards or hiding in shadows. It was living next door, waiting for permission to kill.